Episode 1, Black and White Makes Gray, Memoir of an Interracial Childhood, by Judith Davidson, and read by Judith Davidson. This is 2025, and it's the first public release of this book. I dedicate this book to my 5 siblings, Randall, Janet, Virginia, Yvonne, and Phyllis, and to all people who have struggled to exist in the face of racist barriers. Dear Evan, I'm still trying to understand what happened in 1966 when you entered my life and the lives of my 3 siblings. I wonder if you were as surprised as we were when my white mother left my white father to join you as her new partner. Not only were you black, you were also a jazz musician, and pretty much penniless at that. These things were scandalous in the Portland, Oregon, where we lived at the end of the civil rights era. Decades have gone by, but the experience of those earliest years with you still dominate my mind. As I've gotten older, I've realized there was so much I wanted to ask you and couldn't or didn't. After your death in 1980, I continued to speak with you in my head, carrying on this ongoing imaginary conversation. I've often thought I never would have survived my adolescence without you. You were a critical counterpoint for me in those chaotic times, the walking base underneath our chaotic household. As the oldest of what became 6 siblings spread over 15 years, I am the one who can remember more of the first years of our lives with you. That doesn't mean I remembered everything correctly or interpreted what I remembered correctly. In the end, I can only speak for my own feelings, but did you know I loved you? Did you know I loved your music, bebop to cool, and have missed it deeply? Did you know I grieved that you had to leave us so soon and after so much pain? Even now, decades later, I feel the hurt and sadness. My letter to you, the fragments of those questions, thoughts, and revelations I have been sharing with you in my head are embedded across this book. They wind in and out throughout my attempt to tell the story of those years and how I made sense of living in the gray zone between black and white. Part 1, The Big Green House on the Hill. Chapter 1. Note to Evan. Evan, where were you in the spring of 1966 when I was struggling to find my place in the 7th grade at Ainsworth Grade School in Portland, Oregon? Where were you living and with whom? Were you playing piano in clubs, looking for gigs? Would I have walked past you somewhere? Maybe downtown as I ran for a bus? Where were you then? I know I wasn't thinking of you that early spring. My mind was on the issue of the go-go boots. The go-go boots were supposed to solve all my popularity problems. Close to finishing the 7th grade, I was a short white girl with a pimply forehead and blue cat eyeglasses. My sister Janet, younger than me by 3 years, and I had begged Mom and Dad to buy us the white go-go boots. All the girls were wearing them, and they were all over TV, but especially on the music and dance program, Shindig, which we watched faithfully on the family's little black and white TV with the rabbit ear. But the boots were a complete and utter failure. I had worn them to my first ever school dance, and I was the only girl who wasn't asked to dance once. Not once. After the boots' failure, I knew I had no hope of being one of the popular girls. I could have been thinking about this as I walked home one day from school that spring, kicking at pebbles. Stupid boots. At the thick laurel hedge marking the upper boundary of our property, I might have stopped, as I often did, to take in the view of Portland spread out below me. Our house was on the lower lip of Portland Heights, itself the lower portion of Council Crest, an old volcanic cinder cone. From where I stood, the city was laid out like a panorama, with the Willamette River winding across the middle. I understood that the geographic line carved by the river separated Portland into east and west, and at the same time also marked the division between black and white in the city. Only a handful of white people voluntarily crossed that line, and one of them was my mother. My mother's passion was civil rights. Civil rights was a bigger problem than the go-go boots. Civil rights were a murky concept for me, centered around making sure black people had the rights they were guaranteed by the Constitution and the Civil War. I assumed the worst of the civil rights problems were in the South, where black people had been enslaved. That's why, I presumed, most of the protests, rallies, and marches we watched on our small black and white TV were happening in the South, in places like Mississippi or Alabama, or the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. What I saw on TV made it feel like civil rights was sometimes an outright war. We saw marchers beaten, and we learned about churches bombed and children killed in the violence. Time and again, the camera would show us the face of Martin Luther King, the leader, and his beautiful voice was stamped in our brains. We knew he too had been beaten marching from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, by policemen wielding fire hoses, billy clubs, fists, and kicks. It was happening in our own USA, and you couldn't forget it. I was hoping this war would soon be over. Civil rights were my mother's constant preoccupation, her obsession, and it didn't make for the easiest childhood for me and my siblings. I began to suspect that my estrangement at the school dance had little to do with go-go boots, white or otherwise, and wondered if it might have been retaliation from parents against my mother's involvement in civil rights. My mother belonged to any and every group in the city that had anything to do with civil rights. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, the League of Women Voters, the Urban League, the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, and the Albina Arts Center. That last one was homegrown, local, and had just started. She stuffed envelopes, raised money, attended meetings and rallies, and sat on boards. She was so frenzied in her activism that I worried my teachers and my friends' parents might be wondering if she were totally sane. Why did a white woman, particularly a white woman from Portland Heights, care so passionately about civil rights? Maybe they had warned other children to be careful of me, as if civil rights were something you could catch, like a cold. Note to Evan. This was where you met her, right? At the Albina Arts Center? Did you see her first, or did she pick you out first? What drew you to her? Was it her black-dyed hair cut in a Cleopatra-styled bob? Her intense hazel eyes, or her ridiculously short height? Why did you, someone who had once avoided white people at all costs, even refusing to play music with them for a period of your life, find yourself talking to her, an upper-class, do-gooder white woman? And when did you first travel up the hill to where our house was located? Even if I had passed you in the car, I doubt I would have paid attention to you. Other than cleaning women and gardeners, black people were seldom seen in that neighborhood. Up until that time, no black people had ever attended my grade school, Ainsworth. nor had I ever seen a black teacher in our school. My brothers, sisters, and I called the house the big green house on the hill because my parents had painted it a greenish-gray color when we moved there 3 years before. It was 3 stories tall with a broad porch across the front and tall cedars nearly as high as the second-floor balcony, standing like sentries on guard. It was not the biggest house in the neighborhood, where there were many larger homes built around the beginning of the 20th century, but it loomed large in our minds. I loved the big greenhouse on the hill, and I thought it loved me. It was the perfect size for us, a family of 6 with a dog and a cat. I was the oldest of the 4 children. Randy was 2 years behind me in school, and Janet was a year behind him. Virginia, 7 years younger than me, was at the tail end. I had lived in this house since 4th grade, and I hoped I would never leave. It was filled with good places to play, window seats for reading, and a deep wood behind the house with dense shrubbery and trees that were perfect for building forts. It was also close to downtown. In the summer, we could walk down the hill to swim in the pool at the Jewish Community Center and get sodas and candy bars on the way home. We weren't Jewish, but they let everyone in, just like the Y or the public library. From the Jewish Community Center, it was only a little further to walk to the downtown public library. Cement benches ran all around the building, and Mom would let us walk on top of the benches like tightrope walkers. We always visited the children's room on the 1st floor, usually following that with a trip to the art room on the 3rd floor, where the print collection was housed and where library patrons could check out large framed copies of prints of famous works of art for a month at a time. Each month, Mom would let one or more of us choose new pictures for the house. Note to Evan: when you first came to the house for one of my parents' artistic parties, you might have seen one of the prints over the piano that stood in the dining room. If it were a picture by Paul Klee, you can be sure Janet was the one who picked it. She loved Klee and could identify his style anywhere. I thought of her talent as a very weird superpower. Although I hadn't met you yet, maybe I was sensing your presence. Whenever I came home, I carefully examined the front of the house, like scanning a face for clues. Was anything different? And what could that tell me about what was going on inside? I could depend upon Brownie, our old tawny-colored dog, part terrier and part other things, barking harshly from her post in the side yard as she caught my scent. Most days, my mother's car, a lumbering blue Chevrolet station wagon, would be parked in front. It had always seemed an odd car for her because she was so short that when she drove, all you could see was the top of her head and her long English nose pointing the way forward. But it could hold all 6 of us, my parents, my 2 sisters, and 1 brother, plus our luggage if we were going on a trip. Every year, we were always sure to take a trip to the Oregon coast, where we stayed at Gearhart, Seaside, and other beach towns close to the northern border of the state. We also took car trips to other parts of Oregon. In Central Oregon, we stayed by the Metolius River. In Eastern Oregon, we drove through the desert and learned about the imaginary animal, the jackalope. And in Southern Oregon, we visited Crater Lake. Once we even drove to San Francisco and then beyond to Monterey. On these trips, Randy, Janet, and I often played our favorite imaginary game, in which we each had our own dinosaur bug to care for, a game we had named Gagas. That included a good god, bad god, a taxi that made trips between heaven and hell, and Cheryl, a telephone operator who acted as communication central. During those hours in the car, we were seldom bored. Standing on the sidewalk by the house, I breathed in the scents of Western Oregon, from the massive laurel hedge with its thick, shiny leaves that separated our house from the next one up the hill, to the greening lawns and the evergreen trees along the block and behind the house in the woods. I could even catch a hint of the ivy that grew rambunctiously behind the house and down into the woods. The smells were deep, verdant, damp, and rich, the smells of every spring I'd known. The view of the city with Mount Hood in the background was also the view of the city I had always known. The world seemed so peaceful that spring in the late afternoon sunlight. So why did I feel I was holding my breath, waiting for danger to descend, racked by the feeling all of this might not survive? Note to Evan. In the spring of 1966, did you, too, sense something changing in the Oregon air? Did you feel us approaching you? Of all the children in the family, I looked the most like our father, meaning we both had blue eyes and light, dusty-colored hair. Janet looked the most like our mother, with dark hair, light olive skin, and brown hazel eyes. I'm not sure if that's why our parents always made the two of us share a bedroom, but that's the way it had always been. 2 beds, one on each side of the room. Between us, a long white bookcase 2 shelves high that our dad had made at one time, and we each got half for our books and toys. On the night I'm thinking about, the book I pulled off my end of the shelf was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Hound of the Baskervilles and Other Stories. I was right in the middle of the title story, scared silly but unable to stop myself from reading it. For once I was glad Janet was there, although I didn't want to tell her I was scared. I didn't exactly consider Janet a best friend, but she was the sister closest to me in age, although she was 3 years younger, which often seemed like a huge difference. I had wondered sometimes why Randy, our own one brother, and little Virginia always got bedrooms for themselves. One thing Janet and I did share was the Beatles. I had their photos all over the wall by my bed so I could dream about them, running into them while they were in Portland for a concert. I would be on the way to the library and their limousine driver would be lost and he would stop to ask directions. When they realized what a resource I was, they would invite me into the limousine, and I would go with them to the concert. From there, it was nothing to imagine being asked to visit them in England. I think I liked Paul the best, but if he weren't available, I would have been glad to be George's special pal. As I read the scary book, I fingered the quilt on my bed. I loved to study the pattern of black and white fabrics contrasting with each other and crossed and recrossed by the stitching. The quilt kept me calm in times of stress, like now, when I turned the page of the book and saw the frightening illustration of the hound and almost screamed. Janet walked into the room, a bulge under the top of her pink flowered flannel pajamas. "Did you get it?" I asked her. "Yeah." "Great." I closed my book, threw off my covers, and climbed into her bed. Janet joined me, pulling a small portable radio in a tan leather cover out from under her pajama top. She dialed it to Kissin', K-I-S-N radio, being careful to turn the volume way down before turning the radio on. We leaned our heads together over the radio, trying to hear the song that was being played, but it was not one we cared about. As soon as the song was over, the DJ jumped in and said, "And now, the song you've all been waiting for from the Fab Four. I want to hold your hand." We squealed as softly as we could. It's them," said Janet, "and it's their best song. Shh." We inhaled deeply as the song started and then turned onto our backs, overpowered by our love for the Beatles. The song was way too short, and it felt like it was over before it had begun. "The Beatles again?" asked Mom, walking into the room. She was in the midst of dyeing her hair the black color she insisted it had been when she was a teenager, and she had a stained towel wrapped around her neck to catch any drips from the dye. She said it was her Irish background that was to account for why her hair had started to turn white in her 20s. But the black hair did seem to go along with her signature look, a Cleopatra-style page boy with bangs. I hated the rotten egg smell of the dye and wished she wouldn't do it. I swore that when I got old, I would never dye my hair. Peered at her guiltily from over the edge of the sheets on Janet's bed. Hand over the radio and lights out for bedtime. Just one more song, I pleaded hungrily. No, bedtime, she said, as she pushed a strand of dripping hair back from her face. Janet pulled the radio out from under the covers, turning it off, and passed it over to Mom. I got out from under the covers and crossed the room to crawl back under my black and white quilt. I put my head on the pillow and looked up to John, Paul, George, and Ringo on my wall. Good night, you two. See you tomorrow, said Mom as she shut off the light and partially closed the door. I lay in bed, hands clasped on my quilt, looking at my side of the room. The half-closed door to the hallway allowed for a dim light to filter in. My poodle stood guard on the narrow ledge of wainscoting that ran around the room. My father's mother had crocheted it from orange acrylic yarn, worked around a wine bottle for the dog's body and a toilet paper roll for the long neck and head. I loved it. The only thing I thought I loved more was Coffee Pot, the rag doll the same grandmother had made and given to me for my second birthday. A soft, lanky, pink-skinned creature that was almost as tall as I was on that birthday. I had named her after the black coffee my mother boiled up in the percolator every morning, which reminded me of the long strands of black hair my grandmother had carefully sewn onto the doll's head. Like me, Coffee Pot had blue eyes, which Grandma had embroidered around a small red glass bead, the pupil of Coffee Pot's eye. It had been some time since I'd seen Coffee Pot, and I suddenly wondered where she was. Before I drifted off to sleep, I promised myself I would find her and apologize for having ignored her. One thing that had made 7th grade particularly special was that it was the year when I was allowed to go to the downtown library on my own. After school, I would catch the Council Crest bus that stopped next to the grade school on Southwest Vista Avenue. I loved this long street that ran a couple of miles from the top of the hill, the old cinder cone, to the bottom. As the bus came down the hill, it swished and swung around the curving edges of the street, past tall houses with magnificent rhododendrons, camellias, laurel, holly, and other bushes and trees that loved the damp western Oregon weather. I would stay on the bus all the way downtown to 10th Avenue, where I would get off and walk the remaining few blocks south to the library, with the wide, staggered stairs, and out in front, the beautiful bronze drinking fountain with its 4 spigots pumping water that swirled around in 4 yellow bowls. I was allowed to make this journey all by myself without even a friend, and this was every bit as big of a deal as getting my first library card at 5 years old. Note to Evan. I suppose we could have unknowingly passed each other near the drinking fountain. I'll bet at some time you sat on the benches that surrounded the library. But would I have seen you inside? Did you go to the library before you met my mother, or did you consider it white territory, some place that would not welcome you? I can't imagine not feeling welcome in a public library, a place where I have always felt at home. When I got to the library, I would go to the children's room to the right on the first floor, and this is where I would look at books until my father arrived, shortly after 5 p.m. Then we would walk home together through the downtown blocks and up the steep hill to our house. Being in the library and taking out library books made me feel closer to my goal of going to college. In my mind, college was what to aim for. I believed if you went to college, you were on your way to better things. You could do important things. Certainly, if I wanted to be a children's librarian, I would have to go to college, but that was only one of the many professions I thought I might like to enter. When my father walked into the children's room shortly after 5 p.m., he would most likely have had on his long tan raincoat and dark brown shoes that managed to look like office and hiking shoes at the same time. His office, where he worked for the federal government as an economic planner on issues about the western United States, was downtown in one of the tall office buildings, not too far from the library. He chose to walk to work and back home every day, although no one else living near us seemed to do that. However, it worked out for me because when I went to the library on the bus, I could walk home with him, and this became one of our special times together. The first part of the walk home was flat, while we were still deep in city streets. But the second part became very steep, up the hill, around the hairpin curve, and then up again until you got to our house. I wouldn't have been able to do the whole thing without taking a break at the Safeway grocery store near the library, where my dad would let me get a brownie with chocolate mint frosting swirled brown and green on top. When we set out again, Dad would carry my books while I had my hand in the white bakery bag, breaking off little piece after little piece of my brownie to make sure it would last as long as it could. "Did you want to hear my pronoun cases?" I asked my dad, my mouth half full of brownie. "Is that for French?" "Yes, I've memorized them for the test this week." "Okay, have at it." "Je suis là," I said, running the first group together. "Nous vous ils elle," I said after swallowing. "Moi, toi, lui, il, elle, nous, vous." Very impressive. "Je suis Judy." I am Judy. I smiled at him as I finished my brownie. I usually finish my brownie just as we hit the hill and started climbing the steep hillside. "Do you think I'll be able to go to France when I'm older?" I asked him seriously. "I would think so. If you keep studying French, there will probably be a foreign exchange program you can participate in when you get to college." "I'd like to do that. You can bring the paperback French-English dictionary you got for Christmas last year, and when you come back, I'll bet you'll know most of the words in it." "Je suis Judy," I promised him with another smile. I was glad my father mentioned French and college together. It was another confirmation that I was headed in the right direction and he was behind me. Although his own father, who had migrated to the Pacific Northwest from eastern Texas in late adolescence, had been a sawmill worker and later a farmer on a small farm near Longview, Washington, my father was an engineer, a white-collar worker. The first person in his family to graduate from college and a beneficiary of the GI Bill. He attended Oregon State University in Corvallis, Oregon, after he returned from serving in Europe in World War II. Oregon State University was where he met my mother, 4 years younger, and a member of the Chi Omega sorority. We were both breathing harder now, coming closer to the hairpin curve where the road turned back on itself to climb even higher in the other direction. We usually paused on the sidewalk in the crook of the curve to look back at the city and admire the progress we'd made. From here we could see the beginning of the urban renewal that would tear a swath through the old city neighborhood directly below our house on the hill to make the mighty Interstate 5 that would plow through the Pacific Northwest from north to south, or vice versa. The old neighborhood that bordered Portland State College was composed of older homes, small brick apartments, mom and pop stores, and what remained of the Jewish community that had centered around the Jewish Community Center. My father, recognizing the value of many of the architectural materials that were being destroyed in the demolition, would periodically visit the buildings being torn down to cart away items of interest to repurpose for his own home projects. This is how I came to learn the term cornice bracket, of which there were several sitting in a corner of our basement. Later, they might become a part of a bookshelf or another feature. All of the bricks for the patio and the fire pit that he built on a terrace by the house had been picked up from the remains of the demolition. No one cared what he took, as there was really no market for this stuff at that time. Note to Evan. This was one example I held in my head of the idea of urban renewal, relatively benign, I suppose, in comparison to what had happened to you and your friends in North Portland. I knew about that other example of urban renewal, but I had no idea of its nickname as Negro deportation. Did I think urban renewal was necessary? Did I realize how it might hurt us over time? As my dad and I stood there looking out toward the city, I thought of the questions I really wanted to ask him, but was afraid to. Not because I was frightened of him, but because I was frightened of what the answers might be, or that he might not have any answers for me. The biggest question was, why are you and Mom arguing so much? The night before Christmas, we would always rely on Santa flying by our house early in the evening, checking things out before we got to bed. He would jingle his sleigh bells from someplace in the dark outside and yell in a deep, loud voice, "Merry Christmas, Merry Christmas, ho, 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 Merry Christmas, and to all a good night." After we heard Santa and the sleigh bells, we knew it was time to place a carrot by the fireplace for the reindeer with a note for Santa. At 12 years old, I now understood it was my dad outside pretending to be Santa, ringing the sleigh bells on their leather harness. I knew these were the same sleigh bells my grandfather Petey had used to play Santa for my mother when she was a little girl. Real sleigh bells that had once adorned a sled, wagon, or horse. "Oh, oh, oh," I heard from behind the house. It's him, screamed Janet, rushing out the bedroom door into the big back window on the landing between the first and second floor. "Santa!" yelled Virginia, charging out of her bedroom to meet Janet on the landing. I knew Janet and Virginia believed fervently in Santa, but I wasn't sure where Randy stood on the issue. Then we heard the bells again, and "Oh, oh, oh, Merry Christmas!" from the side of the house near Virginia's room. Randy and I watched our sisters run up that side of the stairs and into Virginia's room. But once again, they were too late, or Santa's sleigh was passing too fast. I had to assume Randy also knew it was Dad pretending to be Santa. But we whooped and screamed with laughter as loudly as Janet and Virginia. That night, as I lay in bed under the watchful eye of the photos of John, Paul, Ringo, and George, I wondered if other families had as many fun traditions as we had for the holidays. I couldn't imagine Christmas any other way. Note to Evan. If I had known then what I know about you now, I would have been sorry you never got to live in a house like this or got to have a Christmas like this as a child. Your mother was only 15 when she gave birth to you, and you were only about 7 when your father died of tuberculosis. Your mother, Nadine, the child of white Effie McGee from the Midwest, and a small dark man named Samuel Tanner Shelby. Well, she was light enough to pass as a white person, and she did on occasion. We know your father was named Evan Kenneth Porter. I don't think I've seen a photo of him. He died in 1942, leaving the earth before his 40th birthday. Nadine named you Evan after your father and gave you the middle name of Shelby, her maiden name, saving that memory for you. I know you bounced around as a child, sometimes living in boarding houses and sometimes with relatives. On occasion, when you were tired of our whining, you'd tell us with some anger in your voice, "You kids have no idea how good you have it." The way you said it was very different than the way Mom would respond when we mentioned we weren't comfortable with her drinking. And she would say, "You have no idea what an alcoholic is." That was more of a tit for tat, as if she were trying to get us back. Instead, your response was cold and firm. There was nothing personal to it. I do know that you were playing professionally in Seattle by the age of 16, and around then started to live with an older woman. Were you a gigolo? A kept man? God damn it, my father screamed as he entered the kitchen. Why can't you write these things down in the checkbook? There was no response from my mother. I could imagine her facing the kitchen sink, her back turned to him, trying not to give any sign or words that would feed his rage. High up above them, on top of the cupboard, over the dishwasher, were two pieces of my artwork. A papier-mâché mask of a so-called Northwest Indian I'd made in grade school, marred by a paint drip that slashed the face in two, and a basket I'd woven from ivy vines and white cotton rags, a creation I'd done on my own time. To the right of the sink was the little shelf where the portable radio sat, high enough that Janet and I had to drag a chair over when we stole it to listen to the Beatles. I work all day, and the only thing I ask is that you note your expenses in the checkbook, he continued to berate her. I listened to them from the small bathroom next to the kitchen, where I sat hunched in the closed toilet seat, waiting for a good moment to pop out and down the hall without alerting them to my presence. My mother spoke calmly, as if she didn't hear the volume or emotion in Dad's voice. Tonight we have the fundraiser for the American Civil Liberties Union. I was counting on you to pick up the liquor I ordered. I imagined her moving to the little red work table in the middle of the room where she did so much cutting and chopping. My dad skulking near the gray formica-topped kitchen table in the alcove, looking down over the backwoods. You care more about civil rights than you do about our family. You spend more time on that work than you do cleaning this house, Dad shouted. These were my father's big complaints: the checkbook, civil rights, and cleaning the house. To be truthful, he was for civil rights. We were all for civil rights. But he believed it was taking over everything in our lives. I pretty much agreed with him on that. It made me wonder once again, when was civil rights going to be over? I assumed civil rights would be over when the good guys won and the bad guys lost. When the bad guys lost, they would have to say civil rights was good, and then everyone would be for it, and there wouldn't be any more racial problems in the world. That time couldn't come fast enough for me. Dottie will be by soon with a load of extra glasses, so we won't run short, Mom continued. Her voice was determinedly calm and under control. Now, I thought, she's warning him that there will be an observer if he keeps yelling like this. Dottie was one of the very smart and funny white women my mother was friends with through civil rights. Oh, I'm supposed to get the booze while you and your friends spend the morning talking about politics? I suppose you also expect me to clean the house before the guests come. As if on cue, the doorbell rang. I heard my mother walk down the hall to answer the door. Dottie, she exclaimed, clearly glad to escape my father's harangue. You've got the glasses. Great. Just what we needed. Can I help you carry them in? I hope you've got a little time. I just put on a fresh pot of coffee. My father had already headed back upstairs to his desk to return to work on the checkbook. It seemed safe, so I chose this moment to emerge. But my timing was off, and Mother turned and stared at me. What does she think, I wondered, that I will tell her friend that she and Dad were in the middle of an argument? Hardly. I was nothing if not dutiful, abiding by the rules which I interpreted to be, don't tell anyone anything. You, she said sharply to me, need to practice. You have a piano lesson tomorrow, and I don't think I've heard you practicing at all this week. I want you to put in a good 30 minutes right now. As I headed for the dining room, I heard Dottie say, Pam, I would love to stay, but I've got a couple kids in the car, and I've got to get them to their lessons. But I will be here tonight. She set the box of glasses on the red work table in the center of the kitchen, and then turned and headed back out the front door. Many hours later, the adults' party was about to start. Virginia had already been put to bed, while Randy, Janet, and I were in our pajamas, allowed to stay up for just the beginning. We held onto the wooden spindles of the balustrade, peeking between them and down at the heads below. Mom was wearing her navy blue knit dress with the stripes that I always thought of as her party dress, tight on her plump body. I realized I knew the couple Mom was speaking to below us. Rufus Butler, director of the Albina Art Center, a black man, and his blonde white wife. They were one of the few interracial couples in my parents' circle of friends, many from interlocking boards of charities and art organizations. He had a deep, rich voice that you couldn't forget once you'd heard it, and he was laughing now. All of us had been to the Albina Art Center at one time or another when Mom had gone there to volunteer. It was on the other side of town in the middle of the Portland neighborhoods where black people lived. Recently, a jazz band had been organized by the Art Center, and several of the musicians, most of whom were black, had also begun to show up at my parents' parties. So good to see the two of you, said my mother as she welcomed the Butlers warmly. Will any of the band be coming? She looked up coyly at Mr. Butler. I don't know, he said. I passed along the invitation. Thanks for including them. Jazz, I groaned silently to myself. It was bad enough we had to be involved in every group in Portland that had anything to do with civil rights. But now she was adding jazz to the mix. She went to listen to jazz in the park. She would get up in the middle of the night to go listen to jazz at the cafe across the street from the downtown library on 10th Avenue, which caused a huge ruckus with Dad, who didn't like that she interfered with his sleep. Now she was inviting jazz musicians to our parties. The doorbell rang again as more people arrived. The three of us left our spot at the banister and parked ourselves on the cushioned window seat 2/3 of the way up the sweeping front stairway. Behind us was the darkening view of the woods where we had tree houses, forts, and special pathways, and further away in the distance were the lights of the city. We watched as an unknown couple approached the stairs from the entranceway below. I've got this one, I said as I stood up, speaking to Randy and Janet with the authority of the oldest. This way, please, I said formally, walking ahead of the couple, up the 2 steps from the landing to the second floor proper. I passed the little hallway with the door of the half-bath at the end and continued to the next doorway, walking into the sitting room off my parents' bedroom. Wow, remarked the woman. That is beautiful. She wasn't wrong. The picture window in my parents' room had been positioned so a viewer would be looking down over Portland with all the lights twinkling and the Willamette River running like a shimmering snake somewhere in the middle of it. I agreed it was magical, particularly on a clear night like tonight. Next to the window and its window seat was a fireplace, where my father would build fires in the winter, and we would play board games on the rug in front of it. On the mantel were some woodblock prints my father had made in classes he'd taken at the art museum. While my father took art classes in the evening, it was my mother who took us to the museum during the day. She would go off to look at a new art show, and Randy, Janet, and I would be allowed to wander around looking at the art on our own. My mother knew that when she was done looking at her exhibit, she would most likely find us on the second floor at a picture of Christ with nails in his hands and feet, staring dumbstruck at the horror of it. We knew Christ was related to Christianity, but we weren't sure we were Christian, as our mother was a fallen Catholic and our father declared he was an atheist and listened to Alan Watts talk about Buddhism on the radio. However, we found this painting fascinating and horrifying. In the sitting room, my parents' desks were placed back to back on opposite sides of the room, almost like an advertisement for their different personalities. My dad, the engineer, and my mother, the would-be writer. My dad had made his desktop from a door, and it was long, functional, and always clean of mess. His papers sorted into files in the drawers. Facing opposite was my mother's antique square writing table of raw, warm, brown wood, stripped of all former varnish or paint. My mother's writing table was always topped with stacks of books and piles of writing, either loose or stored in manila folders. On a corner of the desk sat her deceased father's old Olympia typewriter from his days as an editor at the Oregonian. Whenever I looked at the two desks, I felt the same sense of unease. They were so different. Thank you to Westford Community Access Television for providing facilities and production support, all of which made this podcast possible.